Welcome to Light the Clock. Today, we're talking about school start times and teenager sleep. Why does the early morning alarm feel like such a battle for most teenagers? And could changing school schedules actually help improve their sleep and performance?
Teenagers are not smaller adults. They have completely different physiology. And one of the other things that is changed is how much sleep they need.
You might remember the groggy mornings back in your own teenage years. And if you don't, well, I asked some teens from Italy and Germany how they feel about waking up so early for school.
Hi, my name is Viola and I live in Italy.
Hi, my name is Leah and I live in Germany.
Hi, I'm Giulia and I'm from Italy.
I'm Alice. I'm 16 years old and I live in Italy.
Hi, I'm Margha. I'm 19 years old and I live near Frankfurt in Germany.
Most of them said they really struggle to get up early.
I'm not a morning person, so it's hard for me to get up that early.
Personally, I struggle waking up so early in the morning.
Sometimes because they do sports late at night, or it's because they're up finishing homework for the day after.
In the morning, I have trouble getting up because I go to bed late after studying.
And when I ask them whether they'd prefer to start school later, well, for most of them, the answer was pretty clear.
If I could choose, I prefer if the school starts at 9 o'clock because in the evening I could do more things for me and not only study.
So as I see it, waking up a little bit later in the morning would help all the students.
It would make mornings way more relaxed for everyone.
And if you're thinking, sure, teenagers are just lazy and will always want to sleep more, then well, buckle up, because in this episode, we will dive deep into the biology behind teenager circadian rhythms and unpack the science of why early school starts are not good for their sleep and could actually also impact their performance at school. So, should we change the system, and how? I spoke to our guest, Magdalena Biller, about these topics. Hi, Anna. Welcome back to Light the Clock. I know you have been a guest of the podcast before on an episode on chronotype, so listeners might actually recognize your voice, but maybe you can still give us a brief introduction on who you are and where you're based, and also tell us your connection to the topic of today's episode, so school start times.
Hi, Caro. Thank you for the invitation again. I'm happy to be back. Yes, so I'm Anna Biller. I'm a postdoc at the Technical University in Munich, and I've been here since 2022. And I guess I'm here because beforehand I basically did my PhD at LMU, that's the other university here in Munich, with Till Rönneberg. And there we looked at school start times and how they affect sleep. So really, this is what we're talking about today. It's really my PhD work. And so I'm quite excited to talk about it.
Very cool. So yeah, I'm also excited to dive into this topic and hear about what you've done during your PhD. So I thought we should start with the very basics. So for someone who is hearing for the first time about this idea that schools should start later, maybe we can summarize why are we actually advocating for this. So by we, I mean people who are researching sleep and chronobiology. Why are later school times better, or why do we think that they are better for adolescents?
Yeah, I think we need to go back again and talk a little bit about the changes that happened during this time, during this adolescent time, and also go back to the concept of chronotype, which we talked about last time. So really, I think many listeners know this by now, but really we have this internal biological clock, our circadian rhythm, that really helps to regulate the sleep-wake cycle and many other physiological processes. And light is the main zeitgeber for this. So it's quite important to expose ourselves to the right light at the right time. And so if you expose yourself to different timings in terms of light, then this is one aspect of why you might have a changed rhythm. So you could be earlier or later. But really, there's a lot of genetics behind differences in these kind of changes. So in these rhythms, so whether you're more of an early type or late type, and what we call chronotypes. And this is really genetics, but it's also connected to other more biological factors like gender or age. And so what we really see is during this time when you grow up, that you delay your rhythm. So during this pubertal time, maybe around 10 to 18, this is really a very, very marked difference in terms of how your chronotype looks, basically. So on average, this cohort of people really delays, so they become later. And interestingly, we don't just see this in humans. So you also see this in many animals, actually. And so, yeah, there's always this argument that it's actually just, teenagers who want to party, who want to expose themselves to screens because they are all on their phones and whatever. But really, we also see this in the animal kingdom. And so I think it's a mixture of both. But the important point is really that we see this really everywhere. This is not just in a specific culture or in a specific species. And so in the end, this population moves later. On average, there's still distribution. So you still have early types and late types in this population, but on average, they move later.
So that means that they kind of tend to go to bed later, or they fall asleep later than, for example, after adolescence or before adolescence on average.
Mm-hmm. And so this is one thing exactly that you can see this in the bed times, in the sleeping times. They go to bed later, they sleep later, they, if they could, would wake up later. But you also see that this is not just sort of a rhythm change, but you also see some changes in sleep pressure. So when you build up sleep pressure during the day, usually the sleep pressure will dissipate during the night. Now, in teenagers, this is different because how this basically accumulates during the day, this is just slower, meaning that at the end of the day, you're just not as sleepy as in comparison to your parents, for example. So, of course, you're also less likely to fall asleep quickly or to go to bed early because, well, you're just not feeling as tired. And then there's another reason where we don't have so much evidence, but there is some evidence that basically light sensitivity might be changed during this time as well. And this could then also play a role in this changed entrainment, basically, in the end, where everything is later, your system, how it responds to light is different. And so in the end, this shift occurs.
I see. So basically, just to summarize, what happens is that teenagers during this period, so around adolescence, they get later chronotypes on average. We still see some individual differences between people. They also accumulate less sleep pressure, which is basically saying that by the end of the day, they don't feel very sleepy, like maybe someone who's older or someone who's younger. And then this third thing, which is still research, which is they might be more light sensitive. Is there also something about needing to sleep more? Because this is maybe, I don't know if this is just a popular thing to say that adolescents need to sleep more.
No, this is definitely true. And this is also where I actually come back to answer your question in the end now. Teenagers are not smaller adults. They have completely different physiology. And also one of the other things that is changed is how much sleep they need. And so, I mean, this is a large age group if we talk between like 10 to 20, but still in this age group, you need between 8 and 10 hours of sleep. And this is not something that on average students ever get, really. And it doesn't matter what country you look at. It depends on the age, of course, but still on average, people don't get 8 hours. And this is on the lower end of this range, what is suggested as healthy sleep duration. So yeah, they don't get the sleep they need. And this is particularly because in the end, everything is shifted. They are later. And then in the morning, they have to get up to go to school. And that's why we are now talking about changing school start times, because depending on where you are and depending on the culture, there is different school starting times, but on average, we think it's just too early for them.
Right. So basically, they would go to school and they're chronically sleep deprived, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing. So they're chronically sleep deprived and they can't catch up on the sleep during the weekend, which I think we often see. There's difference between how you sleep during the week and how you sleep during the weekend. Even as adults, we have this shift which we then call social jet lag. But and I think in teenagers it's very well known, right? We always have this image of sleepy teenagers who really sleep in on the weekends because they apparently party all the time, and that's why they need to do it. But of course, this is just a very tiny aspect. The social behavior they display, it's a lot of the biological changes that take part, and that's why you see this.
Right. And what are some of the consequences of having teens going to school sleep deprived? I'm guessing this also can reflect on their performance, for example, at school.
Yeah, I mean, there are different outcomes, and all of these were kind of looked at, and some are easier and some are harder to measure. I mean, short term, when we talk about sleep loss, then we have, and also actually rhythm changes, you always have this short-term effects, and then you have these long-term effects. Obviously, it's a little bit easier to look at short-term effects. And I mean, these are the common culprits that we always talk about. It's like poor attention, memory is reduced, academic performance. This is maybe more of a long-term thing, but it depends on how you define it, might be affected. Your mood regulation is just not as good. That's why you might be a bit on the edge sometimes when you're not really sleeping enough. You might change your risk behavior. Also, something that's often looked at actually in the school start time studies is driving performance. So whether you fall asleep while driving, whether you have any accidents. And then long term, this is, I mean, when you don't sleep enough, this is like increased risk for depression, anxiety, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular issues. So it's just not very healthy at all. Also, what we need to keep in mind for this age group, this is super important, that their brain is still developing. Like adolescence is a very sensitive period for the brain development, and your prefrontal cortex, for example, still develops until your mid-20s. So a lot of things happen during this time, and I think it's a vulnerable time. And so if you put teenagers at risk there by, you know, reducing their sleep, by not accounting for their change physiology, I think it's something that we do to society and to these individuals, which is not very nice and not very helpful for their healthy development.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so basically all of these are negative consequences that these early school start times might have on adolescents. And so now that we have understood that these early start times don't really match teens' inner clock, what do we know about initiatives aimed at delaying the start of the school time? So do we have like evidence in different countries that shows that that actually helps them sleep better and also reduce all of these risks that you just described to us?
Yeah, so especially in California, there have been some recent developments in this area. I think that one of the reasons there why it developed there is, of course, because you have this wide research network, but it's also because there they have this staggered time starts, school start times, where actually the older teenagers start earlier than the younger ones. And this is exactly what we don't want. It's exactly the other way around. And here I want to actually add one more thing. So when we say teenagers, we kind of speak about this whole maybe 10, 12 to 20 years, but really the most vulnerable group are the older ones because they show the latest sleep and also still this high sleep need. And so especially in America, often it's completely the other way around, where some schools even start at 6:30, and it's especially the older ones who have to start so early. And so there was a lot of research going on about this, and also now really this research transitioned into policy changes. And so, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics now recommends that school shouldn't start before 8:30 for middle and high schoolers. And also in California, there has been this bill where it is mandatory now that exactly these schools need to start at 8:30 and not earlier. There's other initiatives in other countries, but they are not as common, or I would say it's mostly research. There is not much really change. I think there is a lot of, discussions about it. But the thing is here really transition into policy changes is so dependent on the culture, on the system, on the educational system, how the educational system deals with like your free time after school. And so it's a very specific thing where you can't just, develop one solution and then you can say, well, this is how it's going to work.
Definitely. Yeah. And we can also come back to that at the end of the episode, how this evidence from scientific studies can be translated into policy, if at all, and what are the challenges associated with that. And in terms of looking at the studies that actually investigated, like in a school, for example, starting 1 hour later, what did they find? Did they actually see improvements in the sleep or in the learning outcomes?
Yeah, so maybe let me first tell you a little bit about what the studies would look like in terms of design. So you could have studies that look at static changes from, as you said, maybe an hour. So they look at, well, what does it make with, depending on your outcome? What does it do in terms of if you change by an hour, by 2 hours, or a certain amount of minutes? Most studies here would look at a delay and not an earlier start time, which is obviously the negative thing that we don't want to do. That's one category of studies. Another category, and I think we are the only one who did this, was looking at flexible school starting times. So where people could choose themselves. And here our system was about 45 minutes later. And then you have some shift studies. So this is also very interesting because in some countries in South America, you'd have different shifts of schooling. So some people would go in the morning, some would go during the day, some would go in the evening. And then you can compare performances, but also sleep depending on what shift you attend. So it's very unique as well, very interesting.
You said you use this flexible start time system. Kids could decide whether they wanted to go earlier or later, like every day they could decide, or how was the flexibility managed, let's say?
Yeah, so in our case, that was very specific. They indeed could choose every day if they wanted to come at 8 or 8:50. There was some who always attended at 8, and there were some who mostly attended 8:50, but most people swapped quite a bit. But yeah, so this made it a little bit harder to analyze because we didn't have the same exposure to this, new system in terms of, was it really 50 minutes later every day, or was it in the end dependent on how often you chose this system?
That makes sense. So you have these different ways of changing the school start times. And then how do these studies measure sleep, for example?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, of course, sleep is one of the main outcomes that people look at. So you could measure this in subjective ways by using questionnaires like sleep diaries, which is a more fine-grained instrument because you can ask it every day. You could even ask it several times a day to assess, for example, sleepiness levels. And then there is more sort of grand surveys that ask, about the past 4 weeks of your sleep, which is obviously really then hard to map it to specific times, but this is used as well. And then there is more physiological relevant markers like actimetry. So where you measure sleep-wake rhythms using this accelerometer that's worn on your wrist, where you can then very nicely see how much activity people have and when they're not very active, where you can then derive from when they probably slept. So this is quite a usual method in circadian research.
I see. And do some studies also measure additional things other than sleep? Also, for example, like learning or mood?
Exactly, yeah. So I would say besides sleep, actually academic performance in whatever way you want to measure is definitely one category that's been looked at. This could be grades, this could be tests, like entry tests for university, but also just regular tests that you have during school. It could also be, in Germany, we sometimes have these tests that you don't know about. So suddenly there's a test, which no one knew. It's very, I think, it's not very nice for students to do that. So this is one way of measuring academic performance. And then you also have more sort of cognitive tests like attention or memory tests, but these are not very often used because, they're very specific. They only measure very specific domains of your cognition. And often the question then arises, how does this translate to your actual performance or your actual behavior in school? Because you have so many influences. This also applies to the academic performance, by the way. And then there are some other very interesting measures from a sleep or circadian perspective. For example, sick days. That could be attendance rates. So how often do you actually go to school? Or this is like, how late do you arrive? Late arrivals. It's also car crashes. So do you have a car crash when you go to school? This is very important for the US context because that's where teenagers drive to school. It's not so much applicable here in Germany, for example. It's also whether you have any changed mood, of course. This is something that people look at. It's also some depression symptoms, for example, or just in general health symptoms. But I would say overall, I think the most evidence really is the sleep, or most studies really looked at sleep and academic performance.
So we have different ways of carrying out these studies. So one thing is the way that you change the start times of school, you delay it, you shift entirely the time of school, or you have a flexible start time. And then you also have different outcomes that you just explained to us. With the results of these studies, do we see a clear picture or is it a little bit messy? So I guess I'm trying to understand whether we actually have solid evidence, whether changing or delaying or, let's say making adolescents sleep more is actually better for them.
Well, let me put it the other way around. It's something I argued in my PhD defense as well. That there is no evidence really so far as I know, and it's harmful. And so I think this is very important because, we're dealing with often very dirty field studies. There are so many influences and we can't control everything. So the question is, do we do anything bad? Very likely not. So does it improve? Yeah. So I think for sleep, we are quite sure that it helps, at least in the short term. Now, this is important that I mention this because I think there's been a lot of advocacy for later school times, and I'm totally agreeing here. For sleep, I think we do know it's good, but really we have to be a little bit careful whether long term the effect really stays or maybe it diminishes a little bit. Because really there hasn't been so many longitudinal studies. So often it's a cross-sectional comparison or a very short term that people look at it. You change the times and then you measure these things. And then after 6 months, nobody knows what happened. Like, do people then go to bed later because they actually adjusted their bedtimes now? Or does it stay the same? And at least in the short term, we know it really has all these benefits. And if you change it by an hour, people would almost get an hour more sleep on average. I mean, it depends on the study and so on, but for sleep, I think we're quite sure it's helpful. For academic performance, I did a review on this actually. And I think, at least from my perspective, I think it's very messy. There are some studies that look at it and see clear benefits. Then there are some studies that find sort of mixed evidence. Some studies don't really find much. At least no one gets worse grades. Again, this is good news, I think. But here I want to point out one or a couple of studies where I think we have a very nice picture that's a bit better in terms of the study design. So I told you about these shift studies where you have different shifts for different people. And when you now compare the grades from these different shifts, right? So if let's say you have a very early type and very late type, and then you look at how they perform when they attend in the morning, during the day, and in the evening, you see in the morning, people would have this huge difference between chronotypes. So earlier chronotypes would get better grades, versus later chronotypes. And this is once because they learn at their preferential time, they get examined at their preferential time, and they're more likely to be just, more awake and probably have better sleep beforehand and also more sleep, I guess, as well. Whereas in the evening, this difference between early and late types really equals out. And so it's very, very nice where you see, okay, it's the sleep, but it's also the timing of everything. And so this is like a little hint on the later section where we talk about what can we do, because it's not just delaying the times, it's also how you really then look at the whole schedule maybe.
Right. So from these studies that use this system with the shifts, so different shifts for different people based on their, let's say, circadian preference, so based on their chronotype, we also have evidence that they perform better at school.
Exactly. So if you match the timing, the internal timing with their external timing, like the learning and the examining times, it's beneficial for them. And also, of course, then they have the possibility to sleep longer as well. So it's not just the timing. It's also, if they don't have to get up in the morning, later chronotypes, then, they can sleep longer. They get the actual amount of sleep they would need, and then everything falls into pieces. It's just better for them. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wanted to ask a question about one concern that I think a lot of people have when we talk about delaying the start of school, which is, okay, well, if we allow teens to wake up later because school just will start later, does that also mean that they will go to bed later? And then that doesn't really make any improvement, right? If we just tell them, okay, you can wake up later, then they're like, okay, well, then I can also go to bed 1 hour later.
This is something that I sort of alluded to earlier a little bit. So of course, this is always really one of the main arguments that I hear. And this is why in my PhD, I did a follow-up study exactly 1 year later in the same people. So it was a longitudinal study. So there's really only a handful, if even, studies that looked at it in the same people over longer periods of time. What we found and what this other study found was that there is a reduction in terms of the effect that you see. So, immediately you see this great effect. People sleep, let's say if you shift it by an hour, they sleep almost, it's not exactly an hour, but almost an hour more. But the timings of the sleep stays the same. It's just onset. So sleep onset stays the same. It's just the offset that changes. That's how you increase your sleep duration. Now, in the long term, this effect of your sleep extension is a bit reduced. So you wouldn't sleep as much as beforehand. But there are different reasons. For example, we saw that this is mostly in boys, not really in girls. In other studies, we can't see this gender effect. And so I think in this sense, we don't really have the answer here because most studies don't look at this. My feeling from what I saw would be you still see an effect, definitely, because, it didn't reduce to only like 10 minutes from an hour. It was way beyond 30 minutes still. But yeah, I think it's a valid question. And before we change the entire system, I think these studies should be done. Although knowing how hard it is to change a system, I think we can do it in parallel.
Right. Yeah. I think this is a nice segue to talking about challenges in changing things. Because so now we drew this picture of, starting school later kind of as a positive thing for teenagers, for their sleep and also perhaps for their academic performance, or definitely something that doesn't harm. And so, of course, naively, you could ask, okay, why doesn't every school then delay their start times? What are the challenges associated with this change?
Yeah, I already mentioned this a little bit, that it depends so much on the culture and how everything is implemented. So I think you can say there are these structural and logistical barriers, and then maybe cultural and political barriers or resistance. So in the first area, I think you have to look at it from the standpoint of how is everything organized. In the US, they have this issue that they have staggered bus timings, meaning that the bus has to come back and pick up the other cohort of students. And so they just don't have enough buses, for example. So they have to have this in a staggered way. If this is not a case and you deal with this differently, then obviously this is not a hindrance. This is not a barrier. But anyways, the transportation seems to be a main issue for many countries and also a very costly one. So it's something that everyone argues the costs are not, they don't outweigh the benefits that you would get. Although I would say this is not so clear. So there's been this project by RAND where they estimated that if you start not earlier than 8:30, this would boost the US economy by 8.6 billion after 2 years, contributing to 83 billion to the US economy within a decade, with an average annual benefit of 9.3 billion over 15 years. So, I mean, I'm not an economist, so I have no idea how this adds up. But anyways, I think it's always just this fear. It will be costing something because change always costs something. And we kind of ignore what it could actually benefit in terms of health, in terms of graduation rates, in terms of, very long-term benefits. So this is definitely an issue that I always hear it's going to be so expensive and we cannot change it. Then there is more this sort of thing like, what do you do with students after they leave, right? So in Germany, for example, it's very different to the US. Here, you often have these extracurricular activities that are organized by private societies. So, once they leave school, we kind of have to figure out how do they get there? Is it parents that pick them up and have to bring them there? If yes, can parents actually manage to do this if it's at a different time? And so on. Whereas in the US, I think it's much easier to integrate this because often these sports clubs or whatever activities take place at school. And then you also have, of course, something like part-time jobs. Would this mean that people can't attend or can't work part-time? Because some, especially after 16 years, of course, in the US, this is something very common. And so they might sort of lose out on money, which obviously is a thing you have to say that, there is this discrepancy between different social classes. And so some people, it's really important for them that they do have these part-time jobs and can work. And then in terms of cultural and political resistance, you kind of always have, I think just this idea that teenagers just have to, face reality and kind of prepare themselves for adulthood. And so why should they need special treatment? And they just have to mature, whatever. And I think it's a very ignorant argument because it completely ignores biology. I can understand that if you look at the screen behavior and so on, I think definitely you can have some behavioral interventions there. But this is just one aspect. It really ignores all the other aspects, like the different chronotypes, the higher sleep need. And I think it's not very fair at all to bring this argument. It doesn't make any sense from a scientific point of view.
Yeah, it also doesn't help that in our society still later chronotypes are seen negatively, right? So then, of course, adolescents who are late chronotypes are also not seen as productive and rather are seen as lazy.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Now, you've told us a little bit about these challenges, and I can really understand that these are really tough challenges. And as you said, also they take time, like changes take time. So even if we will get there at some point to change the start of school in different countries, it will take time. And so is there any alternative measure or solution that can improve the sleep of adolescents in this time and can kind of help them with this chronic sleep deprivation that they face?
Yeah, so we wrote a little commissioned guideline for parts of the Belgian government, this German-speaking part, where we suggested a few measures or implementations. Though, of course, this is not really from an implementation science point of view, right? Like politics has to make a decision if this is feasible or not. But from a sort of chronobiological or sleep research point of view, there are some things we think you could do. And so, we talked about this delaying or flexible school start times, but you could also, as I mentioned, have this shift systems. But of course, this is also a major change, I think, which is not a very short-term measure you could achieve. But I think the most promising measures are dealing with how you actually structure the time when you spend time in school. So you could, for example, try to change the way people are exposed to light in breaks, in their school breaks. So in Norway, for example, it's mandatory up to a certain age that people have to go outside during their breaks. So you just get more sunlight, meaning when you get more sunlight in the morning, you are a little bit advancing your circadian rhythms. So the way you behave during your school time in terms of light exposure, this could be something. Also, depending on how your architecture looks like, you could make some small adjustments so more light comes into the rooms or people are facing in different directions, so on. So this is all about your light exposure, your light behavior. You could, this is maybe a very specific idea, but you could also maybe change your schooling times depending on the season. So maybe in the winter, you start later. In the summer, you could start earlier because that's when sun rises earlier. And so you're probably a little bit changed in your rhythm. You could also have more vacation during the winter, maybe, because this is when it's very dark. And so it's anyway very hard to get all the sleep you need, get the light you need, and so on. I think it's, again, more of a change that takes more time, not a quick solution, but it's an interesting one, I think. But I think the two areas that are most easily changed and implemented could be, for example, that you change when certain subjects are taught and when are they examined. So, for example, cognitively heavy subjects like maths or learning languages, they should really be avoided to be in the first hour of the day, where most people are not ready to learn, they're still sleepy, especially the late chronotypes are very much not ready to do this cognitive load in the morning. So you could, maybe come up with some cool hours where you only have the very cognitive heavy subjects just before lunch, between 10 and 12, and then maybe later on in the afternoon when you avoid the lunch dip as well. And you could just be a bit more aware of the chronotype. So maybe, again, with this, acknowledge the fact that not everyone learns at the same time in the same qualitative way. And another thing we thought of was that you implement some education in the biological class. So you would actually teach students what actually light exposure does to you, how important sleep health is, how important circadian health is, and also maybe implement some behavioral changes that they could do on an individual level. Because of course you could change something on a school level, on a, architectural level, but also on a behavioral level. And so these are all factors that you can influence. But obviously in a short term, behavior might be a quick one, although changing behavior again is in the long term, is a very difficult route to take as well.
Yeah, definitely. But I think your last point on raising awareness among parents, among teachers, but also among teens themselves is super important, because I really don't think that a lot of biology classes in high school teach anything about circadian rhythms. And I don't think they have to go into the molecular things about circadian rhythms, but even just explaining what's happening to your chronotype, what chronotype is, what's happening to your chronotype around this age would help adolescents, definitely. Just being more aware of, okay, why am I struggling to wake up so early, actually?
Yes, and I think just being kinder in general. I think adults often are so mean towards, teenagers with this regard. They always think they're lazy and they don't want to learn. And but, acknowledging the fact that you have a biological reason behind this and being kind and be like, well, maybe we don't do all the awful exams at 8:00 in the morning. I think that would definitely help people. In our study, we also saw that just changing this also increased their motivation to even go to school, right? Or to even, learn a bit more. So I think in some cases, and especially in the lower performance groups, you can have like this really big improvement in terms of grades, but everything like motivation and just, attitude towards how you feel with school. I think you have a lot of improvements you could achieve there.
Yeah. Do any of these studies that you mentioned measure satisfaction with the system that the teenagers experience?
Oh, that's a good point. It's something that we looked at as well. And in our case, the students really liked the system. I think there was no one who didn't like it. But I guess in our case, you could still go at 8:00 if you wanted to, right? So it wasn't, a mandatory change. And then you were sort of stuck with that change. I think an interesting point here that it depends on the person and whether you ask the students or the parents. In our case, again, it matched even the teachers' chronotypes. So they actually redistributed their work a little bit. So the earlier chronotypes among the teachers, they came earlier, and the later chronotypes among the teachers, they came later. So most of them also liked the system. But for example, I've also heard stories where teachers are quite happy that students kind of fall asleep in the first hours, because they're happy that no one disturbs the class. They're not really, making any trouble. And I guess I can sort of see this point in some instances where you have very rough environments and it's just very hard. I mean, teachers have a hard time. I think it's difficult, but still, I don't think this is like the aim that we want to achieve here as a society. So yeah. Depends on the way you look at it.
Yeah, that's funny. Also interesting to think that, sure, also teachers have chronotypes, right? And so yes, they also have preferences for systems in school and start times.
And the parents. I mean, I've also heard a lot of happy parents that they said, oh, finally, I don't have to get up so early, because for me, it's also a torture. Like, I'm a late chronotype. I don't want to get up so early, but I have to because of the child.
Yeah, definitely. That's very interesting. Cool. I hope with this episode also, some adults that remember struggling as adolescents can be a little bit kinder to their adolescent self and be like, okay, that was it. Now I understand better. And I hope to see some change in the next years. I think in some countries, as you said, we are more advanced in seeing changes, and in other countries it will take longer, but there's movement, and there is definitely, from the chronobiology research community, there's push.
I think so. And as you said, I think it's a very nice summary that, just increasing awareness and being more kind about these challenges, I think would definitely help a lot, because that would mean cultural change. And as soon as cultural change happens, you can also implement policies more easily because people accept it. Whereas beforehand, when there's a lot of resistance, it will just take a very long time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Anna, for coming again on the podcast and sharing with us your knowledge on this topic, which is controversial, but super important. So I'm really happy that we tackled it together.
Yes, it was very nice, Carmen. Thank you so much for having me again.
Of course. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. If you're a teen, a teacher, a parent, or someone who wants to show more compassion to their teenage self and learn more on this topic, then check out our show notes. We'll be back on Tuesday, 26th of August, with the final episode of the season, where we'll explore the topic of light pollution and its consequences on human health, wildlife, and how we can design urban spaces to reduce light at night. Catch you then! You have been listening to Light O'Clock. This podcast is produced by me, Caro Guidolin. The podcast team includes many of my amazingly supportive colleagues and lab members. Manuel Spitzchen does the scientific fact-checking, and music, mix, and sound design are done by Ingo Bednarek. Show notes and additional resources are created by Maidel Fernandez Alonso and myself. Our social media team includes Lucien Bickerstaff, Nilufar Tabande, and Zara Alkaf. And Anna Magdalena Biller is our test listener. Light O'Clock is a podcast produced by the Translational Sensory and Circadian Neuroscience Unit, and we are supported by the Circadian Mental Health Network, the Viscom Prize from the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychologie and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychophysiologie und ihre Anwendung, the Max Planck Society and the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, and the Technical University of Munich.